a second recording now. Antigone, I realized that the introduction that I signed was lengthy, it was word dense, and especially the first half was kind of difficult to understand. The second half contains a lot of good relevant information if you'll dig into it. The first half, 1/3 to 1/2, the author was essentially tracing for the last few hundred years the role of Antigone as used by both philosophers and critics to make commentary on what was going on in their culture at that time. And as he pointed out, there's a lot of contradiction in some of the ways that it's seen, the importance of the play, you know, in the way that it's interpreted. And so that's what a lot of the first part of that introduction is about. You will not need to know that. That's not necessarily helpful. I mean, it's interesting to me, but and maybe to others who, you know, are kind of follow Greek tragedy somewhat, but or research it, but it's not necessarily all that useful, I think, to students just first approaching the play. The second half, though, again, has a good summary, does some good character analysis about the main characters, talks about some of the themes. So really it's the second half of that introductory material that I would recommend you take some time to look through. I'm going to touch on a few of the things that it discusses in these notes, but I don't want to repeat to you what you can sort of find for yourself. So let's begin with cast of characters, and I'm going to add some commentary. First of all, you'll notice the spellings differ for Oedipus, for Creon, for Haman, for Eurydice. I've seen it spelled with this, especially the C's and K's are changed out. Tiresias. A lot of the spellings differ just depending on who the translator was. If I slip up on occasion and use a different version, it's simply because I taught it at some point from a different text. And I'm more familiar with the names spelled in those ways. So I'm trying to make sure that I go back and be consistent. But Antigone was the daughter, Antigone and Ismene, her sister, or Esmene, were daughters of Oedipus. And Oedipus, I don't know if you know anything about that story, but their father was the king of Thebes, and he had been, and this is a little bit of backstory, he had been prophesied, it had been foretold that Oedipus would essentially kill his father and marry his mother. And so in an effort to stop that from happening, Oedipus's father exposed him, or his parents exposed him as an infant. Now exposure for the Greeks simply meant they took there's nothing simple about it, but they took an infant that for whatever reason they were not going to keep, and they put it out in the elements. And if the gods, they believed that if the gods wanted the infant to live, it would live, and if they didn't, it would die. And so it's kind of like they left the infant in the hands of fate. And of course, Oedipus lived. He grew up not knowing his past, not knowing who his true father was, his mother, and ultimately does kill his father, and unbeknownst to him, that's who it was, but in a fit of rage and being brushed off on the side of a road, and then does ultimately marry his mother, and then has children. Now, part of the whole play, about Oedipus, has to do with his fatal flaw, and I did include this in your questions. Hamartia, the Greeks, especially in tragedy, believed that Greek tragedy was always about some noble character, some aristocrat, so it's somebody of high birth, and who, for whatever reason, but often they create their own problems because of their hamartia. They have some flaw of character that brings about their downfall, and so it's a great person being brought down, and basically that's the basis of most Greek tragedy. And notice that their definition of the classical hero, a tragic hero, is different than what we would think, because we tend to think of heroes as being people of great moral fiber and character and admirable, and we don't want anything terrible to happen to them. And what the Greeks witnessed, and of course these were stories that were based on legend, they were not created originally with Sophocles. There are other versions of the story, but or other versions. The story, the main ideas stay the same, but there are other versions of it. The tragic character kind of brings about his or her own downfall. In the case of Antigone, it could be argued, perhaps, that she certainly is the cause of her demise and several other people's as well. That's part of the complexity of that character. When we teach Antigone in high school, we tend to emphasize she's a bit more two-dimensional. That's how the textbooks have her. It's the noble person standing for personal, due to her integrity. She combats unfair law, civil disobedience, if you will. But really, Antigone, if you look at it, and that's part of what the introduction to the play establishes, Antigone is a bit more complex of a character, because if she really cared that deeply about family, you'll notice that even her fiance, her sister, she's quick to reject, any help, and both of them. So it's kind of like in favor of doing for the dead. So we'll, it's a bit more complicated than that. But because of Oedipus ends up, refusing to see all the signs in the play Oedipus the King. He refuses all the signs. He refuses to listen to people when they try to warn him that there's a problem in Thebes, and he wants to get to the bottom of it. And suddenly this backstory, his backstory, starts coming out, and he's blinded to the truth. He's figuratively blinded. He's not literally blinded until the end of the play, when he actually does blind himself, when he realizes the truth of his story. And because of him, the whole family's cursed. I mean, you can kind of see this happen. This plays itself out in Antigone. Now, Creon, ironically, in Oedipus Rex, is the voice of reason. He's the one who said, Oedipus accuses him of wanting to take over Thebes, of wanting to rule Thebes, and Creon insists, why would I have all the benefits without having the headaches? He's in a position of power because of who Oedipus is. Why would I want that position? So he actually is the one who's most level-headed in the previous play, but we see that he loses all reason in this play, unfortunately. Antigone is, engaged to her cousin, Hammon, who is Creon's son. Creon had 2 children, and we'll talk about this second one in a second, although he plays no real role in this. Then Eurydice, also Eurydice, pronunciations vary, as a wife of Creon. Tiresias is the blind seer prophet. He plays a role in, I think, all 3 plays that Sophocles wrote about the Oedipus trilogy. And he, is the one who comes in, speaks. He's blind, but he sees. Figuratively, he sees truth. And then, of course, we have messengers, gods, and then the chorus and the chorus leader, and we'll talk about those in a second, but they are usually elderly. Often, if you did the sort of watched the videos and read the information about Greek tragedies, often the people who played the chorus, they were always men, of course, but they were people who contributed. They were wealthy citizens of whatever, Athens or wherever the play was going to be performed, and so they kind of bought themselves roles, and they were part of the chorus, and the chorus often serves to make commentary on what's happening and on different characters, and often provides sort of irony and foreshadowing, but they aren't in the know about everything, which is part of the reason that it's ironic. They are not supposed to represent essentially no more than what the characters on stage themselves know, but they respond to what's happening on stage. Right, there are a series of ghost characters, and I call them ghost characters because they're referenced, but they don't appear. Oedipus, his wife Jocasta, who was unfortunately also his mother, and then they had two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, or Polynices, depending on spelling, pronunciation. And of course, that's these two sons who never appear in the play, but they are what launch the conflict that creates, that the struggle is about. Megarius is actually the other son of Creon that's only referenced, I think, one place toward the end of the play, which Eurydice, his mother, before she dies, claims that, evidently she's crying out for him. He's already dead. He evidently died at some point, either as a sacrifice or during the war, between the Argives and the Thebans. Hades is referenced frequently because, of course, Hades is the god of the underworld, and so the whole idea of being the bride of Hades, because Antigone does not live long enough to marry, and so there's a lot of reference to going down to Hades, or Hades sort of playing a role in this, even though he never appears. The Fates, of course, are Greek, I want to say demigods, but they are the ones who wreak vengeance. I think there are three Fates. Persephone was the goddess who was stolen to the underworld to become the bride of Hades. She's referenced at some point, and especially Antigone compares herself, I think, to Persephone, and going down, and the whole idea of being underground. Of course, at the end of the play, she's shut up in a cave, and much like Persephone was shut up in the underground because Hades basically stole her from above ground, took her under, and then she's doomed to live part of each year underground with Hades. For those of you who've studied Greek mythology, you're probably familiar with the story. She's the daughter of Demeter, who's the earth goddess, and so Persephone is part of the explanation. This was part of the Greek explanation for why there's seasons. When Persephone is above ground, or it's her time to return above ground, that's when we have spring and summer. Then in the fall, when things start dying, it's because Demeter starts going into mourning because her daughter Persephone is going back underground to the underworld with Hades. And of course, Zeus is referenced several times, king of the gods. Little context, just gave you the backstory of Oedipus, and it's referenced a couple of times, especially at the beginning. As many, when she's arguing with Antigone in the prologue, is begging her to not, to not cross Creon. We'll talk about that in a second. To not cross Creon, but instead, think about the family. Haven't we lost enough? Haven't we suffered enough? Because both daughters, when their mother hanged herself, and then, of course, it's a tragedy. I mean, if you've ever studied Shakespeare, the thing about tragedies are the body counts are really high. I mean, by the time the play is over, there is so much suffering and so much death, and that, of course, it started here with the Greek tragedies. So Alcesta, did not survive once she found out the truth about her husband, who he was. She hanged herself, and then Oedipus blinded himself. His two daughters became his caretaker, and he was exiled. And then after he died, they came back to Thebes. So that's where the story kind of picks up. They have returned to Thebes and live with their uncle Creon. And the part of the issue here is that the brothers are fighting over rule. Eteocles and Polynices are fighting over rule of Thebes. I think initially one version has it that the brothers were supposed to share rule, and so it's like they took turns. But another version, it's purely either way. Polynices decided he wanted full rule, and so what he did was align himself with the Argives from Argos, who were sworn enemies of Thebes, and attacked. And of course, both brothers were killed in the battle, but Eteocles died a hero's death, a warrior's death, an honorable death, because he was defending Thebes, and Polynices, as the one who was attempting to overthrow him, died sort of the shameful death. And that's the reason that Creon declared, I don't want that body buried. I don't want no honor given to him. Let the birds pull him and the animals pull him apart. He deserves nothing, no recognition. And that particular ruling kind of flew in the face of what essentially was one of the gods' principles, which is you honored the dead. And especially women, that was their role, was they came behind in the battlefields and they literally saw to the bodies of their dead. And so that's the role that Antigone was determined to fulfill, despite the fact that Creon, who is now ruling Thebes, he's taken over as the next of kin, has declared against it. And so that sets up your initial context. These words were mentioned both in the introduction and they're mentioned throughout the play, and they have to do with the structure of the play. The Parados is the first song that's sung by the chorus that begins a Greek tragedy. It's essentially the prologue. Now, the chorus literally sings together in unison. I don't know how melodic it was, but they would sing. A stasimon is a stationary song that the chorus performs, and so that's mentioned a couple of times. But what I'm sure you noticed were these two words, the strophe and the antistrophe. This actually is the movement. The strophe, the chorus would all move together as they performed a particular ode or a particular song. They would move together from one side of the stage to the other, and then when they returned again, that's the antistrophe. So when you see those terms and you see the lines divided up in that way, what it's showing is this was the part that was performed in the movement from, say, left to right, and then the antistrophe would be the part that's performed from right to left. Okay, and that's just the structure of the plays. Sticomythia I wanted to mention because it's the rapid-fire dialogue. Normally, you'll notice that most of the speeches and the songs are varying degrees of length, but there are places where you've got, as many saying one sentence, and then Antigone saying one sentence, and then as many, and then Antigone, and it's just this one sentence, very back and forth, very quickly. And so, what Sticomythia did, this rapid-fire dialogue, was it increased the pace of what was happening on the stage. It often added some degree of drama, so it kind of changed the tone a little bit. And so it served a particular purpose, because when you have longer speeches, it slows everything down, right? Odes are mentioned several times. They're elaborately structured poems of praise, so that's what an ode is, versus a komos. Komos is an elaborately structured song or poem of lamentation. So one has to do with praising a person, praising a particular act, and then the lamentation would be grief. Usually it was performed by together the main character and the chorus themselves. So the very end of this play, with the lamentation and all that Creon loses and all of the death, that would be the komos. It occurs close to the end, and it's kind of it's that point of grief. Now remember that one of the things, one of the values that the Athenians believed tragedy served was catharsis. And catharsis simply means purging emotions, particularly the emotions of pity and fear. One of the beliefs was that the way that you kept your citizenry content was that you gave them this vicarious way of working out strong emotion. And that's what the plays are supposed to serve. By watching this tragic fall of this woman and then also of Creon, it was supposed to purge the citizens who watched it of perhaps their own fear about things going awry, or the condition of their current city. It was a reminder of maybe their past, and maybe we've learned from this. And so that was actually the purpose, or what they believed was, they didn't of course have psychology, but they psychologically believed that was the purpose that tragedies gave to those who are watching. Finally, I mentioned these three words before. Hamartia is, or hamartia is the fatal flaw. Usually a character brings about his or her own destruction because there's something in them, usually hubris. In Oedipus, for example, it's definitely hubris, excessive pride. That whole idea of pride blinding, and so you can't see the truth. And that's what brings about the rapid fall of a noble character. Then peripeteia is the sudden reversal of fortune. This is a Greek word which means things are going a certain direction. They build, they build, they build, they build. And the climax is the peripeteia, where everything goes south, right? Where suddenly disaster unfolds. So suddenly Creon realizes he's made a mistake, but it's too late to do anything about it, because Antigone dies, and then Haman dies, and then his wife dies, and so that's his reversal of fortune. Quick summary. By the way, there are several really good short videos in YouTube if you want to, if you kind of struggle with what's going on in the play. The actions are pretty straightforward, I think. I don't think this play is hard to comprehend necessarily, except maybe some of the odes that get into, either praising different, different characters, or and what they've done in the past, or the lamentation where it's talking about, for example, Niobe and Danae, and how they too were shut up, and how they too they were walled in, and the catastrophe that befell them. So I realize those odes can get, and the lamentations can get pretty, I don't know, seem convoluted to us because we're unfamiliar with the story as a modern audience, a contemporary audience. But I think that the action of the play is pretty straightforward. You have the death of Polynices, which happens before this even begins, and then Creon decreeing that nobody should bury him, nobody should honor him. Well, it's Antigone's brother, so she feels the duty, and she's defiant because she believes that it's her role to obey the law of the gods, not man's law. And Creon, of course, represents man's law. We've got a series of things that happen that I'm leaving out, but everything from Creon accusing the messenger and the guards of taking money. Notice how quick he is to assume everybody's being bribed. He says that to Tiresias as well. The assumption is, if you're crossing me, it's because somebody's paying you for it. And that says a little bit of something about his personality as well. And then Antigone's defiant, and there's some questions about what she does, and at what point is this sort of intractable will. One of the kind of side themes in this thing has to do with that idea of intractable will, and when is it better to be teachable? When is it better to bend a bit? Now we can argue that she absolutely, and I think most critics would, that she, is a person of high integrity, and therefore she basically followed her, sense of moral understanding to the very end. Is anybody having trouble with sound? I'm hoping everything's okay. Can you still hear me okay? If somebody would just type yes in the chat room, or okay, great, thank you. I notice sometimes when the sessions are lengthier, sometimes it will cut out. I'll try and sort of keep this wrap it up in the next 10, 12 minutes or so. But and initially everybody's afraid of Creon. I mean, you notice that the chorus responds to him. They praise him. They don't challenge him. They think that she's in the wrong. It's when his son Haman sort of comes on the scene that things change. You notice that Haman is he's very diplomatic. He begins by praising his father and talking about he's only looking out for his best interests. And so he tries to tell his dad, not everybody backs you on this. There are murmurs that the fact that he has basically said, because Antigone's defied him, she shall die. I mean, that's it. And he also assumes as many as a part of it. The sister, even though the sister initially refused to join in with this and tried to talk her sister out of it, but he's already just sort of said, that's it. No. And especially you'll notice that he has this thing about women, like, and that's very, very much the times, that there was no point, in that child. Everybody had their roles, and so women's roles were, in the introduction talks about this very clearly. Now Creon, and so initially, and then essentially he alienates his son, and his son, who then just sides entirely with Antigone and goes to her defense. Creon compounds his own problems. Tiresias comes on the scene because there are problems. Because of this issue that where Creon has banished Antigone to under the earth, he's basically saying, let her go to the underworld. Because he's done that, now the gods will not accept Theban sacrifices. They're just there in the streets and not being consumed as I guess they would be if the gods are pleased with you. So there are signs that something is wrong, something has polluted Thebes, and so that's why Tiresias shows up. He said, something's going on here. And then, of course, after he finishes sort of talking and rebukes Creon and basically tells him, you're going to lose because of this, and you're going to lose your son because of it. Finally, Creon listens, but it's too late. And notice that Creon, the first thing he does is he does the public thing. He goes and buries Polynices and has ceremony for him instead of going and freeing Antigone. So by the time he gets to Antigone, she's already hanged herself, and his son, in his outrage, goes for his dad, essentially goes for his dad, misses, and then stabs himself. And then, of course, the turn, Creon, that whole, I think it's a biblical scripture, so did the wind reap the whirlwind. That's essentially what happens at the end. When Creon's wife hears what's happened, she kills herself, and he is left with basically nothing. So that's a quick summary. There are much better, more thorough summaries, both in the introduction and also in some sources online if you want to look at those. But those are the key events. Now I'm going to upload again this PowerPoint to the weeks 13 and 14 folder, so you can look back at these. But I've pulled some sort of key lines from the text, and this includes the page number and then the line numbers. Some of those are approximate, just depending on where the line's broken. But the first one is Minnie refusing to go along with Antigone and saying, and this is in the prologue, in the Parados, we're just women. Who are we to try and challenge what Creon's decreed? And then Antigone gives her justification in these lines, basically saying, I'm justified because I'm doing the will of the gods. And then as many, this is just such a strong line, you have a heart for what is chilling. In other words, you won't listen, and you've set yourself on this path that ultimately is going to lead to your doom. Now, notice throughout I pulled some lines, but these are not the only ones. Throughout this particular play, there are references to the ship of state. The whole idea that like Thebes is a ship, and if you have a good helmsman, the person who's directing the ship, if you have a good captain, then the ship of state is healthy and it's in calm seas, and it can and it's functioning correctly. And so that's mentioned several places. The Ode to Man I'm not going to get into here. If we'd had more time, I would, but it's a very famous ode talking about all of these amazing things that men have accomplished, that over time that humanity has accomplished. It's tamed the seas, it's tamed horses, and yet it gets to the end. But taming passions, ultimately, the whole idea is that there is an outcome, one thing that man cannot tame. Now, in this next line, jumping ahead, has to do with Antigone and Creon's confrontation. These are not the only significant lines. I've just pulled out the ones that kind of I'd highlighted that stood out to me, where Antigone basically challenges Creon and says, there's a higher authority than you. You are not Zeus. Because part of the issue here is that Creon, of course, has disdain for a woman challenging him and says, who is going to respect me as a man if I let this woman run over me and do whatever she wants to? But increasingly, Creon sees himself as being the representative of the city, seeing his law as absolute. And I guess because he maybe even sees himself as a representative of the gods, he feels that whatever he says is what the gods say. So his problem is that he increasingly and passionately loses his reason to passion and becomes absolutely unyielding in what he's originally said. So Antigone's going, you're not Zeus. And then the chorus, who's still somewhat behind Creon at this point, says she obviously doesn't know how to bend, which again is kind of a motif through this of this unbending will. Both Antigone has it, and so does Creon. This is the point at which Creon comes back at Antigone and basically says, I'm the man and you're not, and no woman is going to tell me what to do. The very end of the third ode on these pages foreshadows the reversal of fortune. There's several places where the odes foreshadow what's going to happen, even though the chorus itself is not supposed to know, as actors on this scene. And then Creon, this is where he begins to compare himself to the city. The city must be, notice it's not just him anymore. It's grown to become the city. So his ego has gone to this place where it's I am the city. Now this is where things begin to change, because Haman, his son, arrives. He's Antigone's intended, her betrothed, and he's trying to talk his father out of this death sentence and to pay attention to really what's happening. And he's trying to convince his dad that you need to have more of a teachable spirit. Everybody makes a mistake. You need to back off, And the father instead just accuses him of being heartsick over this woman. There are other women, that you can marry. I don't understand why you're doing this. And then notice that Haman comes back to that whole idea of the capsized ship, that essentially because of a rigid sail, you're unbending, catching the wind will capsize the ship. It will turn it over. So that continues that whole idea of the ship of state motif. Line 610 foreshadows other people's, the Haman foreshadows his own death by saying, you're going to cause more than just her death. The chorus, after hearing Haman, because once again, the chorus represents the sort of notable citizens of Thebes, and so they're starting to turn. Because one of the things Haman tells him is, I hear what's you don't hear what's on the street. You don't hear what's whispered in the shadows about you. People are not talking favorably about what you're doing. And the chorus has listened. The father doesn't, but the chorus does. And essentially accuse, excuse me, they accuse Creon of answering only to himself. And then at this point, the chorus is talking to Antigone, but it also applies to, because this is the last time that she appears on the scene, it applies as well to Creon. Your self-willed temper has destroyed you. Creon very ironically said, these orders are final, and I'm not changing. It doesn't matter what you say. and it doesn't matter what anybody says, that's it. Well, of course, that's ironic because he does ultimately end up bending. Tiresias, the blind prophet, appears on the scene. He starts out very diplomatically, as Tiresias always does, but ultimately he's always forced to bluntly tell whoever the protagonist is, look, you're screwing up, and here's how you're doing it, and here's what's going to happen. So he begins by telling him, once again, that ship motif: you've captained the ship rightly, but your fortunes stand on a razor's edge. So in other words, what you decide to do is going to tip this ship one way or the other. And finally, when forced to be blunt after being accused of taking money, Tiresias tells him, give way to the dead. In other words, Polynices, he's already dead. You're not going to bring him back. You know, why do you keep dishonoring something that's already been dishonored? Go ahead, bury him, give him, you know, make it up to the gods so they'll no longer be angry at us. Notice that Creon in these lines challenged the gods themselves. So he's moved from being his own sort of center of the law to seeing himself as the representative entirely of the city. Whatever he says, the whole city feels, and then ultimately whatever he says, the gods feel. So this expanding ego, right? But ultimately he's reminded, you know, Tiresias kind of tells him this is going to end, you're going to lose everything. And finally Creon listens after Tiresias leaves and says it's terrible to give way. It's so hard for him to bend, but when he finally does, it's too late, of course. So the messenger summarizes in these lines everything that's happened. I used to envy Creon, but I don't envy him no more. He's lost all of these things. And then the final lines are the chorus talking about man cannot control fate. If the gods have decreed it, you're not going to overrule it. So, final ideas. And some things to think about. What is the role of fate? Was the outcome inevitable given these two characters? And given the fact that Creon had this sort of fatal flaw, maybe of pride, maybe of power, maybe of ego, but he had this flaw that he absolutely could not bend, especially not bend to a woman. So that gets into the gender issues. Who is the tragic hero? There's a lot that's discussed about, you know, how Creon is in many ways also a tragic character, as is Antigone, of course. Lots of conflicts. I got these. Most of these were mentioned and discussed in the introduction. The state versus the individual, the public law versus family responsibility and love, divine law versus human law. And then passion versus reason. And finally, the role of the gods in all of this. They never actually appear on the scene, but they're referenced quite a bit. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Do you have any questions for me about the play that you'd like for me to answer? That's a quick synopsis. Anybody with any questions? Okay, if not, then I will send out I'll upload these two PowerPoints and I will send out the video links to both of these recordings. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you do have questions. For the remainder of the semester, I sent out an email about the paper being due, the draft being due. Originally, it was going to be Monday, but anytime in the next week, I'll take it, and as soon as it's in, it won't be this week, but as soon as it's in next week, I will try and have quick turnaround time and get back to you with any commentary. I mean, with my feedback. The final paper is due the last day of class, which is May 3rd. Your test will open. All the work on Antigone is due on Monday night. The test will open next Friday after I've had a chance to grade all of your information, and it will remain open through the following. I may not just Monday. I may leave it to Tuesday or Wednesday of next week so you can take the test during that period of time. But please don't hesitate to call me or email if you have any questions. Have a good afternoon.